What happens when a billionaire rejects his own son simply because of the color of his skin? In Texas's wealthiest family, Alexander Harrington had it all: power, wealth, and 2 white children he adored. But when his black son Daniel was born, he turned his back on him. Years later, when the empire began to crumble and Alexander lay sick and alone, guess who was the only one by his side? This is the shocking story of betrayal, forgiveness, and the rejected son who rose to become the cornerstone of a billion-dollar empire. The Harrington estate sprawled across the outskirts of Houston, a pristine white mansion framed by tall oak trees and manicured lawns that stretched toward the horizon. It was more than just property. It was a symbol of the Harrington legacy. Alexander's company, Harrington Global, dominated Texas's real estate, technology, and luxury resort sectors. To the public, Alexander was the embodiment of control and success. Inside the mansion, however, unrest lingered. Alexander paced the sterile white hallway of St. Mary's Hospital, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the tile. He checked his Rolex for the 10th time. His wife, Claudia, was in the delivery room. Nurses moved in and out, faces unreadable. He'd been here twice before with the births of Lucas and Isabella. Those births were celebrated in glossy magazines, complete with photographers and family portraits. But this time, unease coiled in his gut. "Sir." A nurse emerged, smiling tiredly. "Congratulations. You have a healthy baby boy," Alexander exhaled, shoulders loosening. "A boy. Another heir." He straightened his jacket and entered the room. The scent of antiseptic and sweat lingered. Claudia, her caramel skin glowing, lay against the pillows cradling the infant. Her curls clung to her damp forehead, but her smile was radiant. "Alexander," she whispered softly, "come see him." "He's perfect." Alexander's eyes fell on the child. The small bundle squirmed, tiny fists waving. His skin was unmistakably brown, rich and warm, like Claudia's. Even as a newborn, his features, full lips, delicate nose, were clear. The air left Alexander's lungs. "No," he muttered. He stepped back. This isn't right." Claudia's smile faltered. "What do you mean?" "He's our son." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Our son should not look like this." The words sliced through her like a whip. She clutched the child tighter, her eyes blazing. "Are you saying that because his skin is like mine? He's not yours?" Alexander turned away, fists clenched. His voice was low and sharp. "Do you know what this will mean for the family?" "For the company?" A Harrington heir paraded. He stopped himself, choking on his own ugliness, but the implication hung thick in the air. Claudia's eyes filled with tears. "He's your son, flesh of your flesh. Deny it all you want, but nothing can change that." The baby whimpered, his cries filling the silence. Alexander refused to reach for him. Instead, he stared out the hospital window at the Houston skyline, his heart locked in pride. When the birth certificate needed a name, Alexander spoke it flatly. "Daniel." Claudia repeated it tenderly, whispering to the child. "Daniel Harrington, my beautiful boy." Daniel grew up in the Harrington estate, but his childhood was shadowed by his father's cold indifference. Alexander rarely spoke his name. At public events, Daniel was left behind while Lucas and Isabella were displayed before cameras as the heirs to the empire. Lucas, blonde-haired and blue-eyed, was everything Alexander wanted. Loud, brash, and magazine-cover handsome. He grew up with private tutors, country club privileges, and endless indulgence. Isabella, with her golden curls and porcelain features, was pampered into vanity. Both treated Daniel like a shadow, a quiet reminder of their father's unspoken shame. Only Claudia gave Daniel love. She read him bedtime stories in the sunlit nursery overlooking the gardens. She told him about her childhood in Oak Cliff about resilience and dignity. She sang to him at night, whispering that he was enough. But children notice. By 6, Daniel saw the difference. At family dinners, Alexander praised Lucas's achievements and Isabella's piano recitals. When Daniel tried to speak, his father's eyes slid past him as if he wasn't there. One evening, as Lucas boasted about his new dirt bike and Isabella preened about modeling scouts, Daniel said softly, "Mom and I built a birdhouse today." The birds. "Not now, Daniel." Alexander cut him off, not even glancing his way. Silence followed. Daniel's cheeks burned. Claudia reached under the table and squeezed his hand. That night, as she tucked him in, she whispered words that would shape his destiny. "The stone the builders reject, my son, will become the cornerstone." Don't ever forget that Daniel nodded, tears in his eyes. He didn't fully understand, but he understood her voice, the strength in it. Daniel Harrington grew up surrounded by wealth that never quite belonged to him. The sprawling Harrington estate in Houston was both a palace and a cage. As Lucas partied through prep school and Isabella became the darling of high society galas, Daniel learned to disappear into corners with his books, sketchpads, and questions no one bothered to answer. At Harrington Academy, a private school funded by his father's donations, Daniel excelled quietly. While Lucas coasted on his surname, Daniel devoured economics textbooks and taught himself coding on an old laptop Claudia had secretly bought him. Teachers whispered about his brilliance, some daring to suggest he could outshine Lucas. Alexander shut such talk down quickly. "He's not the future of this family," Alexander would say curtly. "Focus on Lucas." But Daniel didn't need Alexander's attention anymore. By 16, he was running small online businesses, coding after midnight, and investing in startups with money he'd earned tutoring classmates. He watched people closely, studying their weaknesses and their pride. He understood, even then, that legacy wasn't handed down. It was built. Meanwhile, Lucas was everything the tabloids adored and investors feared. Arrogant, reckless, and entitled, he blew through trust funds on luxury cars and scandalous parties. Isabella floated from one engagement to another, more concerned with fashion weeks than family business. Claudia remained Daniel's anchor. She'd meet him in the quiet of the library late at night, the glow of a single lamp between them. "You're not like them," she'd whisper, tucking a stray curl behind his ear. "And that's not a curse, Daniel." It's your strength, he believed her. When Daniel graduated valedictorian, Alexander barely clapped. At the lavish party thrown for Lucas's 21st birthday that same summer, Alexander gave Lucas a vintage Aston Martin. Daniel received a stiff handshake. But in the shadows of that party, a powerful moment unfolded. Evelyn Carter, a formidable board member and longtime family ally, found Daniel standing alone by the terrace overlooking the Houston lights. "You're not like your brother," she said, sipping her champagne. Her eyes were sharp, testing. "And that's precisely why some of us are watching you." Daniel turned, startled. "Watching me?" Evelyn smiled thinly. "Empires don't always fall from enemies, Daniel. Sometimes they rot from the inside. And when that happens, the sharpest minds, not the loudest voices, take control." That night, Daniel didn't sleep. Something inside him shifted. He left Texas for Stanford, graduating with honors in business and computer science. While Lucas wasted money on failed investments, Daniel quietly built a reputation in Silicon Valley as a strategic genius. By 28, he'd founded Atlas Dynamics, a tech startup valued at over $500 million. His name began appearing in Forbes, not as a Harrington heir, but as Daniel Harrington, visionary entrepreneur. Meanwhile, Alexander's empire was faltering. Lucas's impulsive decisions had tanked several ventures. Isabella's endless spending caused public scrutiny. The board grew restless. Investors whispered. One humid Houston evening, as rain lashed against the Harrington mansion, Alexander sat in his study, staring at crumbling financial reports. For the first time, the man who'd built empires felt fear. His legacy was slipping through his fingers. Claudia entered quietly, placing a steaming cup of tea on his desk. "You should talk to him," she said softly. Alexander didn't look up. "Lucas will fix it." She stepped closer. "I'm not talking about Lucas." Alexander's jaw hardened. "Daniel is not—" She cut him off, her voice steady. "Daniel is the only one who sees what's coming." "You've ignored him long enough, Alexander. Maybe it's time you face the truth." Her words lingered long after she left the room. The Harrington Global boardroom was legendary. A long, polished walnut table beneath a chandelier imported from Paris. Walls lined with oil portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Deals that shaped cities were made there. But on that sweltering Houston morning, the air inside was heavy with tension. Alexander Harrington, now in his early 70s, sat at the head of the table, his once commanding presence dimmed by stress and illness. His hands, though still steady, gripped his cane tightly. On either side, executives and board members shifted uneasily as a screen displayed plummeting stock graphs and bold red headlines. Harrington Global under fire. Lucas Harrington accused of SEC violations. Lucas, dressed in an expensive suit that couldn't hide the panic in his eyes, sat beside him. Isabella scrolled on her phone, detached as ever. Alexander's voice broke the silence. "We will weather this storm. We've survived worse." Evelyn Carter, the seasoned board member who'd once spoken to Daniel years before, leaned forward. "No, Alexander. We haven't survived this. Lucas's recklessness has damaged our reputation. Investors are fleeing. We need decisive leadership." Now Lucas slammed his fist on the table. "I am the future of this company." Murmurs spread. Several board members avoided his gaze. Evelyn turned her attention to Alexander. "There's another option." "One that many of us have quietly discussed." Alexander frowned. "And what option is that?" The boardroom doors opened. Daniel Harrington stepped in. Tall, composed, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, Daniel radiated quiet authority. The room fell silent. For years he had been the ghost in the family legacy, the one they overlooked. But not anymore. Evelyn rose. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe it's time we consider a leadership transition." Lucas shot to his feet. "You can't be serious." "Him. He's barely part of this family." Daniel's gaze met his brother's, calm but unflinching. "I may not have been your idea of family, Lucas, but unlike you, I've built something real." Alexander's cane hit the floor sharply. "Enough!" The room stilled. His eyes, once cold, now betrayed conflict. He turned to Daniel. "Why are you here?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Because your empire is falling apart, and whether you like it or not, I'm the only one who can save it." A hush fell over the room. He advanced toward the screen, pulling up new slides he'd prepared. "Harrington Global doesn't need more parties and bad press. It needs restructuring, streamlined divisions, strategic mergers, real innovation." He laid out a thorough 5-year turnaround plan, numbers, projections, partnerships. His voice was measured, confident, every word sliced through the tension like a scalpel. Evelyn watched, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. She wasn't surprised. By the end of the presentation, even the most skeptical board members were nodding. Lucas, humiliated, pointed at Daniel. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you?" To take what's mine, Daniel met his glare. "No, Lucas. I've been waiting for you to earn it, but you never did." The vote was swift and historic. The board, by majority, named Daniel Harrington as interim CEO. Alexander sat in silence, the weight of years pressing down on him. Pride and shame wrestled behind his eyes. As the room cleared, father and son were left alone. The silence between them was no longer cold, it was fragile. Alexander spoke first, his voice quieter than Daniel had ever heard. "You've become something I didn't expect." Daniel looked at him steadily. "I became what you refused to see." No reconciliation came that day. But something shifted, a crack in Alexander's walls, faint but undeniable. The Harrington mansion in Houston had grown quieter over the years. Once filled with grand parties and sharp laughter, its marble halls now echoed with the faint sound of footsteps and the low hum of medical machines. Alexander Harrington sat by the tall window of his study, his once broad shoulders slightly hunched, a cashmere blanket draped over his knees. Age and illness had softened his edges. The cane he once carried like a scepter was now a necessity. Outside, the gardens he'd built as a symbol of his empire bloomed untouched, as if indifferent to his fading strength. His empire, however, was no longer fading. Under Daniel's leadership, Harrington Global had transformed. He restructured divisions, sold off failing ventures, launched new tech initiatives, and restored investor confidence. Within 3 years, the company was more stable than it had been in decades. Lucas had disappeared into quiet obscurity after a series of scandals. Isabella moved abroad, chasing luxury and fading social clout. But Daniel stayed. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but because this legacy, broken as it was still his family's. Claudia remained his constant supporter, standing proudly at his side during press conferences, board meetings, and public appearances. She never once said, "I told you so," though everyone knew she'd seen Daniel's potential long before anyone else. Then Alexander's health declined. The diagnosis came quietly, like a thief in the night. A terminal illness, months left at most. For the first time in his life, Alexander's power meant nothing. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rumbled over Houston, Daniel walked into the study. The man who'd once ignored him now sat waiting, frail but alert. "Daniel," Alexander began, his voice raspy. "You didn't have to come." Daniel approached slowly. "I know." Alexander's gaze drifted to the company reports stacked on the desk. "You saved it. Everything I built. You saved what I was too proud to protect." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He took the seat across from his father, the same seat he'd sat in countless times as a child, unnoticed, unwanted. Now, the roles had shifted. Alexander's eyes filled with something Daniel had never seen there before. Regret. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "About you. About everything." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I wasn't waiting for an apology," he said softly. "I just didn't want to become you." Alexander let out a breath that was almost a laugh, shaky and weak. "Good." They sat in silence, rain tapping against the glass. For years, their relationship had been a battlefield of pride and silence. But in that quiet room, forgiveness slipped in, not loudly but gently, like light through a cracked door. In the final weeks of Alexander Harrington's life, the mansion that had once echoed with power dinners, social galas, and decisive footsteps grew hushed. The grand hallways were dimly lit, the usual bustle replaced by the quiet shuffle of nurses and the low hum of machines in the master bedroom. Alexander, once a commanding figure who had built an empire with sheer will, now lay confined to his sickbed, his frame diminished, his breathing shallow but deliberate. His cane, once carried like a scepter, rested unused in the corner, a silent symbol of strength that had faded. Lucas and Isabella stayed away. Whether it was pride, discomfort, or fear of facing their father's mortality. Neither returned until after the final breath had left him. Phone calls were few, visits non-existent. Their absence hung over the house like a shadow, but Alexander never spoke ill of them. He simply stopped asking if they would come. Daniel, however, was a constant presence. Each morning he led the company with the same precision and quiet authority he had demonstrated in the boardroom. And each evening, without fail, he returned home, changed out of his suit, and climbed the grand staircase to his father's room. There, he would pull a chair beside the bed, open one of Alexander's worn leather journals, and read aloud passages written decades earlier, dreams of expansion, youthful ambition, memories of a man who had once believed himself invincible. Sometimes Alexander would listen with his eyes closed, the faintest smile tugging at his lips as he traveled back through his own words. Other nights he would interrupt to explain, to reminisce, or simply to hold Daniel's gaze in quiet understanding. It wasn't forgiveness in words, it was forgiveness in presence. Claudia was always by Alexander's side. She would sit quietly beside the bed, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, offering warmth where words failed. Her steady gaze anchored the room, a reminder of unwavering love through decades of triumph and pain. In those intimate evenings, surrounded by the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft patter of Houston rain on the windows, the three of them formed a fragile circle, a family rebuilt not through grand gestures, but through quiet, shared time. When Alexander finally slipped away one still morning, the house did not erupt in panic. It simply stilled. The nurses closed their notebooks. The rain outside slowed. Daniel stood beside the bed, his hand resting on the same blanket he had adjusted countless times, and exhaled a long, steady breath. Claudia stood on the other side, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. Days later, under a cloudy Texas sky, they laid Alexander to rest in the family plot behind the mansion he had built. The garden was in full bloom, indifferent to the grief around it. Lucas and Isabella arrived, their presence muted, their faces unreadable. But Daniel did not look their way. He stood at his father's graveside, hands clasped, the weight of legacy and blood pressing against his chest. There was no bitterness left, only clarity. Alexander's empire was now in his hands, not as a prize seized, but as a responsibility earned. As the final words were spoken and the first clumps of earth fell, Daniel felt something shift inside him. The story had come full circle, not with fury, but with quiet resolve. At the funeral, Evelyn Carter spoke to the press. He was the son they didn't expect to lead, the cornerstone the builders once rejected. And in the end, he carried the name farther than anyone before him. Daniel didn't build statues or rename the company after himself. He simply led, with quiet strength and vision. Years later, portraits of Harrington leaders would line the boardroom wall. Among them, Daniel Harrington's portrait would hang, not as the forgotten child, but as the man who transformed the empire with resilience, intelligence, and grace. And when visitors passed through the mansion's halls, they often stopped at a small framed quote Claudia had hung at the entrance. The same words she'd whispered to Daniel as a boy. "The stone the builders rejected will become the cornerstone." If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Boundless Echoes for more dramatic, emotional, and unforgettable stories. Your support helps us bring more narratives to life. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode.